Welcome to the latest Tablet podcast. I'm Ruth Gledhill, Assistant Editor of The Tablet, the International Catholic Weekly, and with me again is Liz Dodd. And Liz is a sister of St Joseph of Peace. And today, of course, we're going to talk about the passing of Pope Francis, his legacy, and who might succeed him. So actually, we'll take the third of those first, Liz, who might succeed him. And my money, having interviewed Cardinal Michael Fitzgerald, one of 4 cardinals, and the only one we have in England who's not able to vote in the conclave, but he's told me he was definitely going over for the conversations beforehand, because I think he's quite a good voice, quite a prominent voice among the cardinals. And he told me his favourite was Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines. What do you think? Who's your favourite? Are you prepared to say, or who do you think is the most likely?
Oh, I'm very, very much prepared to say. I know it's the done thing at this point to say, oh, it's all up to the spirit and no one can predict. But, the next 4 weeks are going to be all about predictions, and whether or not they have any impact on what goes on in Rome, I don't know. But we only get to do this every so often. So I say, let's go for it. Tagle is definitely a name that I've heard. Obviously, that would be a kind of continuity choice, very much a Francis man, fantastic on issues like the environment and refugees. And a gift to the church in the Philippines as well, an absolute gift, and a gift to all of us because of the energy that comes out of that church at the moment.
And the first ever Asian Pope he would be.
First ever Asian Pope. My thought is that I think he might still be a little too young.
Yeah, 67 years, isn't he?
Yeah. And young is a wonderfully ambiguous term in the Catholic Church. So, but he is among the other possible contenders. He's a young choice, and I just think that the cardinals would be hesitant to go with somebody who could possibly be Pope for such a long time.
He looks very young as well, doesn't he?
He does.
And he looks as though he could go on till he's 100 or something.
Which is great. And like that energy is a really good thing and could be fantastic for sort of people's conception of what the papacy is. But does anyone want a Pope in place for 25 years?
Yeah, John Paul II. John Wilkins, a former editor of The Tablet, who I remember writing for him when he was editor. Did you ever write for him?
I did, or knew him through. Yeah.
He never had a conclave.
Did he not?
In his whole time as editor, because John Paul II just lived for such a long time. Saint John Paul II.
Now, there's the possibility that the cardinals would think maybe what the church needs right now is 25 to 30 years of continuity. That's not beyond the realms of possibility. But I just think his is a name that might come back up next time.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. Cardinal Parolin is another one, isn't he? Secretary of State, and he's 70, and he looks a bit older, and he seems a bit older.
I think that sounds like a very, very strong possibility, which knowing conclaves means that it won't be him.
You go in the Pope and you come out a cardinal.
Exactly. And I think that might be the case for Parolin. I think, again, a really sort of stable continuity choice, trusted, I think, by a lot of cardinals, obviously has a great background and history and knowledge of how the Holy See works. I just have that niggling feeling, as you were just saying, that his name is almost too prominent at this point for him to emerge as Pope. And I think that's the case with a lot of the other names that are coming out. Syrah, for example. Even I've heard people talking about Tobin as a sort of outline, where I think any of those names that are coming up as people's sort of political choices at the moment will fade away. My outside bet, and I'm not even sure if this is possible, I think he's just about young enough, is Cardinal Czerny, Walter Czerny.
Oh, really? Why that? I'm not sure I've heard
So
him mentioned before. That's really interesting.
yeah, so he worked very closely with Francis on refugees and migration. Real social justice man. So great continuity there. I haven't heard his name around much, which, according to my theories, means that it's possibility. The only thing, and I mean this in the best possible way, the only thing against him is that he's a Jesuit, and there might be a hesitation about having two Jesuit popes in a row. But I don't know. That's my sort of name to watch. And again, I'm probably going to discover I looked up how old he was, and I think he just gets in, which again could count in his favour. Uh, but that's who I would. I mean, my hope is that the spirit will guide the process and we'll end up with the best possible person.
Yeah.
But if I had a choice, I think that might be it.
There's one guy who's really probably is way too young. He's only 60, but who I think if he was a bit older, he would definitely be in with a very strong chance. And that's Pier Battista Pizzabella, who's the
Mm.
Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, but he's Italian. And the Italians, they're desperate really for another Italian pope because they've had a Polish pope, German pope, Argentinian pope, and I think they would love someone from Italy again. And he's such a fantastic man. He's done so well in the Holy Land, and he's so loved there. And of course, Francis, among many bishops and archbishops and cardinals of the church, was very passionately interested in the Holy Land, and he has really impressed. And I just think that at 60 he might still be considered a little bit too young.
Yeah, and that's another name that I've heard as well. I think a really good pick. Again, I saw this fantastic quote from our former colleague Maddock on Twitter on X the other day, saying that trying to predict who's going to be Pope is impossible because it's not a left-right sort of binary. There are about 17 different layers, and two of them are to do with being Italian.
Yeah, I read that Twitter thread. It was a really good Twitter thread, and
Yeah.
it was a papabile Twitter thread. And also, Maddock made this very funny comment about that people were talking about the Pope Francis's tendency to eschew pomp and circumstance, particularly the red shoes that all popes actually have worn before, but Benedict, with his particularly stylish choices of red shoes, made particularly famous, and the white trousers, which Francis said would make him look like an ice cream seller. And so I think it will be really, the next pope, it will be a real signal from the very start, whether he goes back into the papal apartments or stays in Santa Marta, and whether he adopts the formal dress with all the lace and everything like that, or whether he sticks to what Francis did. So, in a way, it's a little bit of a burden for him because he can't help but signal something, whatever he does on those fronts. But anyway, Maddox said every now and again, the Catholic Church just needs a pope who likes accessories. You've got to have an accessorizing pope. Well, that might, yeah.
Such an important point. I wrote a column at the beginning of this week for another newspaper, about what happens next, really. And I did sort of what secular press wants you to do, which is to talk about the legacy and the politics and all sort of that kind of thing. But I ended up saying, I think maybe Francis' biggest legacy is how he did the papacy because of those things. And I agree with Maddock that an accessorizing pope is an important thing. But if the next pope does go back to living outside of the Casa Santa Marta, if he does go back to helicopters and all that sort of thing, it's a political statement.
Well, exactly.
Move the papacy away from that.
Yeah.
And so possibly our first read on the new guy will be, and whether that's a fair or not, I think it's a positive step for the church that we've moved away from that.
Yeah.
And then the funeral was all about sort of toned down,
just one coffin, not three, that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. But because always what people have been saying about Francis's papacy is he might not have changed much doctrinally, but he changed the tone of the papacy. But that, of course, that can be continued, or that can be changed back quite quickly if they did elect someone who wanted to change that back. But I think because he chose 2/3 of the cardinals now in the in the electoral college, I can't see them going back to a not very conservative man. I'd have thought they would either choose a centrist person who would consolidate and stabilise, or go for another. The unlikely one, I think, is they'll go for someone else who's kind of quite radical.
I think you're right, but I think one of the gifts that Francis gave the church was those 110 cardinals, or however many it was that he picked, that it was a global choice. You know, he went and sought out people from the church in Africa, the church in Asia. Now
From the
they're
ends of
not
the earth, as he
from the
described
ends of the
himself.
earth.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to reflect his agenda.
No, that's true. Very good point, actually.
And they might indeed be, in some situations, more conservative.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing about Francis, that his concern was for the diversity of the College of Cardinals and representation, you know, the world's church, not just the white European church. And that might have cost him real kind of succession planning.
Yeah. Yes. To what degree do you think he did choose the cardinals based upon his legacy? And
I think more recently there will have been more legacy planning, and I don't think that comes from Francis himself wanting to ensure that his agenda continued, that he had an agenda at all. But I do think that he might have looked at what's going on globally and thought the next pope needs to be someone who can stand up to Donald Trump, who will speak prophetically about what's going on in the Holy Land, who can stand up to Vladimir Putin. I wonder if we looked back now at some of the more recent picks, we would see cardinals who maybe reflected a few more of Francis's political concerns. Whereas I think over the last decade, say, the consistories would have been much more about that global build. And then perhaps as Francis himself realised that his time was running out, and in terms of global politics, the world was getting pretty awful, he would have been shoring up the church's response to that.
yes, yes. On Monday, I actually it's a bit like the death of Kennedy anyway, or for me it was anyway. I'll never forget hearing about the death of Pope Francis and where I was, because I was about to go with HCPT to Lourdes on their annual pilgrimage when I got the news on Monday morning, and had to delay their flight of all the pilgrims, all the children and their helpers and their carers, while they tried to retrieve my suitcase from the plane, which they did eventually after about an hour, and then get back in my car and drive back into London and go to work. So it was quite dramatic, really, for me personally.
Yeah.
But then on Monday afternoon, Vincent Nichols, Archbishop of Westminster, and Timothy Radcliffe did a joint press conference. Now, besides Michael Fitzgerald, the three other cardinals we have over in Rome, three of them voting in the conclave. The three voters are Arthur Roche, and then Vincent Nichols and Timothy Radcliffe. Now, I'm sure nobody will be offended if I say I doubt very much Vincent Nichols will be elected Pope. But it's very interesting with him and Radcliffe because they're both 79.
Mm-hmm.
And if Francis had lived just a little bit longer, they would not have been entitled to vote.
Mm.
So I think they might have quite a significant influence on the conclave, especially Timothy Radcliffe, actually, who's so loved, former head of the Dominicans. And he's such he's religious, and I'm not being critical of Vincent Nichols at all, but he's a secular priest, what we call a secular priest, whereas Radcliffe is a religious priest, and he kind of emanates holiness.
Mm.
And when he was sitting there at this press conference, I was thinking, is there a chance he could be Pope? I know he's not been that well recently, so possibly that might stop it. But they could even go for someone who might be quite Pope for quite a short time. What do you think?
That's a very good point. And of course, Timothy Radcliffe led those retreats around the synod as well.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Well known, very well liked, very well respected. And I think one of the wonderful things about Timothy Radcliffe, obviously we're shoring up now, because if he becomes, we want an invite. One of the many wonderful things, but no, is that I hear from some of my sisters fantastic stories about Timothy Radcliffe and the Dominicans when they were, I guess, in the 70s and 80s, sort of chaining themselves to nuclear weapons silos and things like that. They were really radical, and they still are.
Yeah.
But I think Timothy Radcliffe really skillfully balances that line between being a radical and having a concern for social justice, being a sort of tablet man, but also being enormously respected in the more kind of quote unquote conservative sort of traditional world. And I think that's his authenticity. He's done a few formation talks that I've been to as part of my own formation as a religious sister, and he's wonderful. Like, even talking to younger religious about a future that none of us can really envisage. He's prophetic, grounded, open to new ideas. It would be an outside pick, but I wouldn't be against it,
And what about Arthur Roach?
I think that's slightly less likely. I think, again, a very well-known and well-trusted voice. Similarly, somebody who has managed to sort of span some more maybe liturgical conservative interests and the Francis papacy. But I don't know if he has quite that sort of prophetic presence in the college that Timothy, for example, might do. And Timothy also has that slight advantage of having been made cardinal really recently. So we know that he's someone who was in the Pope's mind within the last few years, which is interesting as well, because like I say, I think the past few years of Francis's papacy will be what gives us the clues about what he hoped his legacy would be.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think a really important question as well is where the power is going to be in the next week or two. Now, in the last conclave, we heard a lot, or we have subsequently heard a lot, about the English-speaking bloc having a lot of power, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, and that's sort of the group that convened around him. I don't know, and particularly with the influence of Trump and the US Bishops' Conference, I don't know if that's going to be the centre of power now. I think it might come from somewhere else. It might come from the African cardinals.
Trump, of course, came to the funeral, and along with Zelensky. Putin wasn't there, of course.
Yeah. I read a fantastic piece, I think it might have been in The Guardian over the last few days, an interview with Francis Campbell, who was, I think he was the ambassador to the British ambassador to the Holy See, about the incredible diplomatic opportunity that papal funerals offer. You suddenly get all these people together, and because of the timing of the funeral, people would have arrived the evening before. And so there are opportunities there for people to get together, to meet, to have conversations ahead of the main event, which I think is really interesting.
Yes, and I wonder if that would have any influence. After the funeral, of course, we're now in this 9-day period of official mourning, and then the conclave starts after that. I feel it could be over pretty quickly.
I'm trying to think back to the conclave that I covered when I was at the Tablet, when I was in Home News. And I think I can't remember how long the conclave was that elected Francis. I think it was 2 days, 2 or 3.
It was very short, yeah.
It felt like it went on for weeks. you just go into, and again, I'm almost envious of you all in the tablet office. You go into this special bubble, don't you, where this is everything for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And there have been, I think the longest conclave I read somewhere recently was 2 years, 2 or 3 years. So
There
what
have been
happens?
some really long ones in the past
Yeah,
when they just couldn't make up their minds.
yeah. And what happens to, for example, Cardinal Nichols if it goes on for 3 years? Does he still, do you get evicted? Is it like the Traitors or Big Brother if you kind of age out before the end of the conclave, or do you just stay in? It's such a strange time.
Patrick Hudson, our foreign editor, is heading over there for the conclave.
That's going to be amazing. What was it like? I've been dying to ask you all these questions, Ruth. I love that you were waiting for an aeroplane when you heard the news. So the news came out on Monday and you went to press on Tuesday.
Yes.
That must have been a pretty hectic couple of days. Or because the Pope had been so ill, were you in a space
Well,
where
it's
you
quite
were
interesting because we are a weekly magazine with very long lead time. So our print deadline is Tuesday afternoon, late Tuesday afternoon, but we don't actually appear. Our date is always masthead date is a Saturday, although some people might get us in the post on Friday, and you can read us online from the Thursday before the Saturday normally. So we do have quite a long lead time. So after the Pope became very ill, of course, we did go into planning mode for how to plan our coverage. And I suppose for us, from a printing schedule point of view, the worst possible time for a Pope to die would be on the Wednesday or Tuesday evening, late Tuesday night. And so, of course, this is not the most important thing in the context of global events at the moment. But Monday morning at that time was actually, it was fortunate for us. I don't want to say the Pope's death was fortunate in any respect, but from a timing point of view, it kind of couldn't have been better.
Yeah, I was thinking that I would say among my prayers, and my continuing prayers ahead of the conclave are, please let it be at a good time for the tablets press it. I remember Pope Francis was elected, that conclave finished on press night. I think we might have still been going to press on a Wednesday, but it was about 6 p.m. on the day we were going to print. And we rang the printers because I think there must have been the white smoke. So we knew we were going to get a name. And we rang the printers and said, could you stop the presses for an hour and a half and we will scramble to get the new Pope on the front of the magazine. And we did it. And I remember one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, our then foreign editor, James Roberts, who had been an international correspondent who reported from war zones, sat in the corner of the editorial office and wrote the foreign news lead about the election of Pope Francis, just in this whirlwind of chaos around him. And he just sat down, zoned in and wrote it. It was amazing. And we happened to have, by sheer providence, a bio of Cardinal Bergoglio ready to go. And we put a picture, and I remember the biggest debate was, did we put Francis the First or just Francis on the cover? It was an amazing moment. I think this might be a long one.
Right.
Watch me now be proved wrong, but I think there's so much going on, and Francis's papacy was so controversial in some ways that I think there's going to be a lot, those first few rounds of voting, there's going to be a lot of just evening the ground out before anyone emerges. That's my hunch, but
So Liz, you've got a column, haven't you, in the tablet?
That's right. What a week to have a column as well. And I've I talk a bit about Pope Francis. I don't want to give too much away, but I had the most extraordinary experience. It's not quite as good as your experience on the in the aeroplane line. On Monday morning, I was coming back from spending Easter with my parents. I was on the train from Oxford back up to Birmingham, and a couple sat next to me, and they opened a bottle of champagne, which was the first thing that caught my attention. And they were talking about how sad they were the Pope had died. And talking about the Pope and drinking champagne, I knew I had to get involved. So I sort of took my headphones out and we got talking. And they were a married gay couple. They'd been together for 15 years. They married as soon as it was legal, and both their wedding and their early lives had been absolutely they've been persecuted basically by the Christian background that they grew up in America. And in Pope Francis, they'd found somebody who reconciled them with Christianity. And so we spent this whole train journey talking about how great Pope Francis was. And then at the end of the journey, when I got off, they gave me a bunch of flowers that they'd been taking home as a sort of like, and I was like, what? That's Pope Francis, isn't it? That a married gay couple are the first people to say, we're sorry for your loss. Here's a bunch of flowers. That's extraordinary. So I was like, not only is that extraordinary, but that gives me a great thing to say at the start of my column.
Yeah, and Liz's column, by the way, will be in the tablet later this week, and that will be online on Thursday and in print on the newsstands on Saturday. But it was similar for me, Liz, because I'm a convert to Catholicism, and under previous popes, because but I'm not perfect. I've got many flaws, and sometimes those flaws have manifested themselves in my personal behaviour and my personal life. And so I did feel as a result of all that I wasn't kind of good enough to be a Catholic, that I would never get over the line. But Pope Francis's the way he spoke about people, and the way he wanted to make the church welcoming and inclusive, and not a church that rejected people on such grounds, it made all the difference to me. And then of course I went to confession and that kind of thing, and everything was fine, and I was able to be received. So he just completely made the difference and made the church accessible for me and possible for me to join. And I'll forever be grateful to him for that. And I think there's many people out there who feel the same about him.
That's really beautiful. I think maybe one of the kind of quiet legacies of Pope Francis will be the number of people who've stayed in the church because of him. And there'll be people who've come into the church because of him, but I think there will also be people who just got to the point with the abuse scandals of the way the church treats gay people and all this sort of thing, people who would have thought, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
And then along comes a pope who flips the narrative in a gentle way, but who changes. And I think this for me is the thing that will always stay with me. He changed the image of the church from something that was a private members club that you had to fight to stay in, to a community that welcomes and is expanded by diversity and inclusion, and is there to help people on their pilgrimage with God. It's not a way of kind of shoring up and protecting ourselves from the outside world. It's a way of being in the world and letting the world be with us.
Exactly. And I just loved the way he kind of personally lived out the gospel of social justice. And he really did walk the talk, didn't he?
Mm.
He walked the talk, and he was, I thought, he was someone who then again, you would want to follow in his footsteps.
One of the things that does choke me up when I read about it and when I sort of think of it is the phone calls he was making to that Catholic parish in Gaza. And I saw somewhere that on Saturday night, I think it was, he had either made a phone call or was communicating with them and said something like, I'm really grateful for what we've built here or for what we've done here. So I think he probably knew those were some of the last conversations he was going to have with them. I saw a headline or a quote from that parish saying that they feel like orphans now,
Yeah.
that relationship with Francis was so special. But I think it emerged as well that he'd spoken to them every night for a year and a half.
Yeah. I know
Like,
it was really such a, and that was the level on which he was so good. And when Timothy Redcliffe was talking about being made a cardinal, and how he'd kind of completely bypassed the usual formal processes, and that so as a result of which he didn't find out he'd been made a cardinal until he opened his inbox, and there was kind of about 50 emails from people congratulating him. And then he was summoned to kind of meet him and talk to him, and he was clearly so impressed with him and so loved him and was loved in
yeah,
return.
yeah. I think you really get that sense from people who knew him. I love Austin Ivory's piece in the tablet of last week, talking about his relationship with Pope Francis. And I've seen Jim Martin, the American Jesuit priest, talking about his friendship with Francis as well. And, they talk about there's a real warmth and humanity there. And it must be so difficult to keep that going when you're in that position as Pope.
What about people like Mary McAleese, the former president of Ireland? She had a piece in the last tablet as well. But she was quite critical of him, about very disappointed she was, and many other people are as well, actually, that he spoke about the importance of giving better treatment to women. But at the end of the day, wouldn't even open the door even the slightest little bit on women deacons, for example.
Mm.
And so really, some people feel that nothing really changed and that it was just all talk.
I think that's a really important point. The column that I filed for the Eye earlier in the week, I sent him my original copy, and then my editor pushed back on a couple of things just to say, we feel like there's more realism here, because it's your instinct, isn't it? When someone dies, you suddenly forget all the problems that you had with them and you think they're wonderful. And it was true that in the column, I'd just bypassed a lot of the problems that I had with Francis' papacy, which are exactly the ones you just mentioned. Women seem to be a blind spot. And I love that in all the coverage in the last couple of weeks, whenever the national press has talked about Pope Francis and LGBTQ people, it said relatively progressive. I was like, that's exactly right. It's relatively progressive. If there were other national leaders who had said and done some of the things that Francis had done, they wouldn't be having the outpouring of love and respect that Francis is right now. But I think even for me, as someone who was critical of the Francis papacy in some of the areas that you've highlighted, that little word relative is really important.
Yes, also it is a fact, isn't it, that even if he'd wanted to push ahead with women's ordination, even just as deacons, there would have been an incredible pushback from the church, and would have been very divisive at this particular time.
I think he was doing the right things. I feel with the issue of women in the church that it's never going to progress until women are in positions of leadership in the church, because for all the advocacy and solidarity that some good men might show, it's not at the top of their agenda. A bit like what we saw with the lectionary and the gendered language in lectionary. I don't think the English Bishops' Conference picked a gender exclusive translation to be mean. I think it just didn't cross their minds. And that's the problem we have. There aren't women there in the room. There aren't women there in the conclave to say, what about the issue of women priests? Because
maybe by putting women in voting positions in the synod, he was starting to address that.
Exactly.
Although it might have been Mary or someone who pointed out that all the women he did put in those positions were nearly all religious women.
That's true. And we
One day, Liz.
I was going to say that is no sign that there's going to be progress, is it? I think, yeah, again, it not to be not just sort of hagiography, but I think Francis was probably aware that women were a blind spot. He was a good listener, and I think he'd probably listened to criticism from women. And knowing that he wasn't going to be the person to sort it out, he did put women in positions of power who will make that argument on behalf of women, because men aren't.
So, what do you think will be the biggest challenge facing his successor? Because, I mean, to me, one of the biggest losses of Pope Francis at the moment is how important his voice was in the present political global context. So, one of the few people in a position of real prominence speaking out against the current far right agenda, which seems to be capturing the a political field in so many parts of the world at the moment. And he was continuing to stand very bravely, actually, for migrants, refugees, anti-war, for poverty, for poor people and so forth. What I wonder if the most challenging thing facing his successor will be how to negotiate the church's voice on the geopolitical stage and on the environment as well, of course, and with this kind of real pushback from senior politicians all over the world against net zero.
I think you're exactly right. I think the church is at a real crossroads. This is a really difficult moment. Either we can be, or we can live into Francis's vision of being a community that advocates for the poor, the marginalized, migrants, which comes with political risk. It means doing the sort of thing that Francis was doing, like standing up to Donald Trump, writing angry letters to the US Bishops' Conference, or we decide that that's too much and we go for a safer, perhaps more traditional candidate who just pulls the church back in on itself and says, no, what we really need to focus on is Latin better than English? Or should our lectionaries look like this? Or should our liturgies look like that? Either we continue to grow into an outward-looking church that puts itself on the line for people who are suffering, or we pull back in and we become a community that exists solely to keep the Catholic Church going. And the other problem facing the next Pope is the decline of sort of institutional Catholicism in Europe and America. We're seeing there've been amazing stats coming out recently about the number of people going to church, but we're not seeing a great uptake in the number of people becoming priests. So what does that mean for the church in Europe, for the church in America? Now, if the next Pope decides that's the biggest problem facing Catholicism and makes that sort of thing his whole focus, we possibly go back to more of a Benedict XVI, John Paul II sort of papacy. Or, as I say, we go in the other direction and we say, do you know what? Some of these are issues that we can sort out in-house, and our role as followers of Christ and the presence of God among the suffering is to call out dictators like Trump and risk the consequences.
Which way do you think they'll go? Because this is really the crux of the matter, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? And only the Spirit. There I go. Having said, people just say, "Oh, it's up to the Spirit," but that's it. I mean, my experience of the Spirit of God is that it pulls us towards the poor and the marginalized, and so I would hope that would be the direction the cardinals feel nudged towards. But humanity is at stake, and other people don't have the same understanding of the Spirit of God as I do. Not in a sort of like understanding, but they might hear the Spirit of God in a different way and decide to
Yeah.
turn inwards.
Well, I hope we'll meet and talk again very soon after the election to discuss all this, because it's so fascinating. And it's
What a
not just
time
fascinating and interesting, but it's actually really important.
it is. And like I say, my prayers are both for the cardinals, but also for the editorial team at the tablet.
Thank you, Liz. Well, thank you for listening and watching. And please do consider subscribing to the tablet if you're not already a subscriber. Check out our website, thetablet.co.uk/subscribe. If you want to try us out first before subscribing, you're able to do that. You can sign up to our free newsletter that comes out twice a week. And again, you can find that on the website, the sign up form for that, thetablet.co.uk. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we look forward to being with you again very soon.